G'day everybody. I'd like to begin by paying my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we stand, the Muwinina people, to their ancestors and any other Aboriginal people we have with us today. Let's acknowledge that sovereignty of this land was never ceded and that we stand here on stolen land. Also like to acknowledge our guests, Eric and Andrew, my Greens colleagues, Senator Nick McKim, and Leader of the Tasmanian Greens, Cassie O'Connor. Mary, congratulations on 40 years. It's a wonderful achievement. Mohammed, FECCA is a wonderful organisation, and it's wonderful because not just of the terrific leadership, but because of the contributions of staff and volunteers over many decades who have contributed to the wonderful multicultural nation that we are. Now, usually a speech like this does go on with a number of platitudes about multiculturalism being the fabric of our nation, that we're the most successful multicultural nation on earth, and so on. But I'm not going to do that today. Today I'm going to force us to be honest with ourselves and to acknowledge that while many Australians embrace multiculturalism, there are fracture lines appearing that we cannot continue to ignore. That there is a truth we need to confront. That yes, we are and have been a kind and decent country, but there's no hiding from the fact that ugly, overt discrimination is on the rise. Just took a look at the recent surveys from the Scanlon Foundation's Mapping Social Cohesion report. Now, the Scanlon Foundation's mission is to measure how our migrant nation hangs together. And Professor Andrew Marcus, who's the author of the report and a leading expert on social cohesion, had this to say. We think of social cohesion in a country like Australia as money in the bank, but we're running out of reserve funds. The numbers still haven't shifted much, but there are some indicators that the reserve, that is our capacity to deal with shocks that might be running down the line, is running out, that we're not resilient. It's a phenomenon that's not just restricted to Australia, of course. This is part of a global trend of reactionary and populist politics. We've seen the election of Donald Trump, for example, whose campaign was centred around reclaiming an America of the past, and he was going to build that wall between America and Mexico. I heard just a few days ago it was going to be electrified and he was going to put spikes on the top of it and shoot people who crossed the border. In the UK, you've got the Brexit vote, which is a particularly ugly form of nationalism. It's tearing their country apart at the moment, and it's taking away opportunities from young people. In Brazil, we've got a president that's waging a war on the indigenous inhabitants of the Amazon. A third term for Prime Minister Orban in Hungary, who argues that who argues against migration from Muslim countries and warns that a Europe with a mixed population has no sense of identity. So, these aren't fringe groups. These aren't voices at the periphery of politics. This is at the centre of politics right around the world. And there's an irony here that it's often the politics practiced by the right, and this is a free market right, who were once a friend to migrants, as a driver of economic growth, as a seemingly low-cost form of labour, and yet they're pulling up the drawbridge. They can't pull it up quickly enough. So we've got to ask ourselves, what's going on? What's going on here in Australia and around the world? Well, here in Australia, our success when it comes to multiculturalism isn't an accident. Social cohesion doesn't happen by accident. It requires planning, funding, prioritisation, a conscious effort. It's a work in progress. Our success is because we've invested in migrant settlement services. We've provided support to people, an ethic of care. We've assisted people to learn English. We've helped them find employment rather than punish them for not being able to get a job. As Andrew said, we've taken on racism. We've run anti-racism campaigns in the past. In the past, we haven't given legitimacy to those voices of hatred and division. We also know that multiculturalism thrives, and it has thrived in Australia, when there's been a sense of the collective, a common sense of purpose, where people feel that their quality of life is being improved. Now, right now, those things aren't happening. We've seen support for settlement services cut, and Australians are angry and frustrated. Australians are angry and frustrated right now because wages aren't going anywhere, the cost of life's essentials are growing, there's been an underinvestment in transport leading to congestion, causing frustration. People hear a lot about growth and prosperity, but they're not feeling it. They read about corporate profits, they hear about all this wealth that's being created, but they're not experiencing it. And you know, politicians have always been good at exploiting differences. That is a truism of politics. Politics of fear and division is very, very powerful. And the sad fact now is that the circumstances are right that allow politicians to exploit that difference and turn people against each other. Migrants are used as scapegoats for the failures of governments, for their failure to plan and invest in public transport, in infrastructure, in public sector jobs, in stagnant wages and unemployment. Let's remember that migration actually creates jobs and brings investment in. It's there in the data, it's there in the government's own reports. The Shaping the Nation report shows that without migration, workforce participation wouldn't have grown 1.4%, it would have dropped by 2.1%. So all of this begs the question, what to do? Well, the first challenge is we've got to redouble our efforts to improve the architecture, to get our policy settings right around our immigration system. More support for settlement services. Moving away from a punitive approach to an approach that's based on an ethic of care. More support for people to learn English, but no punishment for people who might struggle because they're looking after a family or trying to find work. Promoting a positive vision for multiculturalism, taking on racism wherever and whenever it occurs. We need a fundamental change in the approach to people who are seeking asylum in this country, because that undermines support for multiculturalism. We've got 30,000 people right now living on temporary protection visas and a range of other visas who don't know what their future holds. I've had the privilege of meeting many of them and hearing their heartbreaking stories. Children who need support, who aren't getting it, at a time when it will determine the course of their lives if that investment was to be provided. Brilliant young students who can't get into university because they can't afford it. People whose work rights are limited. And of course, that's not to speak of the unspeakable cruelty that is going right now in those offshore prisons, where children's lives are being torn apart and where we're creating an epidemic of mental illness. The good news is that Australians do care, and you only need to look at what happened with the Sri Lankan family from Biloela. When people can connect with fellow human beings as people, when they're not nameless, when their stories are told, that stuff's hard to ignore. Of course, that's why, when it comes to asylum seekers, it's out of sight and out of mind. Because the moment we connect with people as human beings, our instinct is to look after and care for them. That's why the Greens would abolish temporary protection visas. We'd abolish offshore detention. We'd ensure that our multicultural services are well funded, that our institutions with power, whether they be the Parliament or the boardrooms of Australia, reflect the diversity in our country. It's why we support a Multicultural Act to once again reinstate a positive vision for multicultural Australia. The government currently doesn't support it. We hope to work with the Labor Party and the crossbench to get support for a Multicultural Act. We can do all of these things and the cost of not doing them is far too great. The second challenge, and it's a more difficult and a bigger challenge, and it's beyond the scope of FECCA, but FECCA needs to be an active participant in this debate, is the recommitment to a democratic project. When you've got governments that are giving away hundreds of billions of dollars in tax cuts, running down public services, running down infrastructure, life gets harder for people, and we see an erosion in support for multiculturalism and immigration. We need to invest in our infrastructure. We need to invest in all of those public services, whether they be healthcare or education, that make life easier for people. The story of multicultural Australia is my own story. So my folks came from Italy, post-war Italy. They worked hard. They made a contribution to this nation. Their children are teachers, factory workers, builders, lawyers, and they even produced a politician. Now, we've got a lot to thank Australia for, a hell of a lot to thank Australia for. But Australia has a lot to thank us for, and the millions of families right around this country, just like ours, who have made Australia a better, stronger and richer place. So our challenge right now is to recommit to that positive vision, a vision where everyone in Australia is included, where we recommit to the institutions that support multicultural Australia, an Australia that values the diversity of its citizens as the asset that it is, rather than as a scapegoat for its own inaction. And lastly, we need to recognise that if social cohesion is like money in the bank, then our reserves are running out. It's time for an investment in our infrastructure, in public services, to create meaningful, secure and well-paid work so that those fault lines in our communities are repaired, so that we can realise the potential of a rich, diverse community, and so that we can once again say with meaning that we are the most successful multicultural nation on earth. Thanks, everyone.